So we're starting our new series on book study through the Gospel of Mark, and give a little background, a little bit of introduction to this all tonight. And so if you got a Bible with you, I invite you to turn with me to Mark chapter 1, and we're going to be looking at verse 1, and we're going to kind of overlap a little bit. We'll go in verse 1 to verse 3 today, and then we'll start looking a little bit more into verses 2 through a few other verses next week. So if you got a Bible, go to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. So it says this: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that is the very opening line, the beginning to this gospel, according to Mark. So really quickly, I want to kind of define this word gospel, because what would happen a lot of times in ancient documents, especially longer ones, is the first line of that document, of that letter, that writing, whatever it would end up kind of becoming the title of it. And so whatever is in that first line, people would pull from that, and they'd make that the title. And so we have the word gospel, and we use the word gospel mostly in our modern day. We think of the gospel as either the Bible as a whole or the story of Jesus. And before these gospels are written, the word gospel was just a generic Greek term, and it simply meant good news. So that word gospel in the Greek that is used, that Mark uses here, literally just means good news, or it means good tidings. So if I were to come to you to bring you a gospel, literally what that means is I'm here to give you good news or to give you good tidings. And because of this use in this letter, the gospel of Jesus Christ, now because of history and because of the circulation of these letters, now we equate the word gospel to meaning either the Bible as a whole or the life of Jesus, specifically the Gospels, as we call them, the four Gospels. And so what immediately sets up, Mark goes right in, and immediately he sets this up. He sets precedent for what is this letter, what is this about, and the very first thing that he wants you to know is that this letter is the good news about this person named Jesus, and he is the Son of God. That the very first qualifier that he gives for this letter is that this is good news. That not that this is okay news, not that this is just news, but that this is, or even just positive news, but rather that this is good news. And Mark wants to set this up right away, right from the get-go, that this is good news. So I want to give you a little bit of background to Mark. This is a little bit more of the boring stuff, to be honest, but I think it gives us a bit of a picture to know kind of what is going on as we're reading this gospel, as to why it was written. Having a bit of understanding of the background of the Gospel of Mark helps as you read it to understand, okay, why is Mark using the stories that he uses? Why is he using the words that he uses? If we can understand the audience that he's writing to and when and why he's writing this letter, it makes a lot more sense as to why he puts in what he does put in or why he doesn't put in certain things. So here's a little bit of background to Mark and who he was. So Mark was a close companion of Paul. We see this specifically in Colossians 4:10 and as well as 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul mentions him by name as a close companion, but also throughout the book of Acts, there's I think it's 9 references to Mark. He's also called John Mark, which is his other name that people would refer him to. And I am totally forgetting why they use Mark or John Mark. I think I totally forgot. So I guess we'll figure out maybe next week or something like that. So he's a Christian scribe, meaning this is a man that he is very literate and he writes really well. And so he is writing down this gospel based on the account of Peter. And so he's also a close partner of Peter, which we find in 1 Peter chapter 5. And so Mark is a very close companion to some of the most influential people of the early church. And so he is there on missionary journeys. He's there part of all sorts of things that these apostles and these disciples are doing. And so Mark would have had very, very close relationship with the very people that walked with Jesus, knew Jesus by name, saw his miracles. He was more or less, you could say, an eyewitness. It's not exactly clear if Mark actually saw Jesus and actually met Jesus or not, but it's likely. But at the very least, he was a very close companion to those who were eyewitnesses of Jesus. And then Mark's gospel is written around the year 55 AD. And so there's the way calendars were created, the calendar that we use today. Does anybody know what the calendar is called that we use today? It's a really weird word. Yes, the Gregorian calendar. I don't know anything else about the calendar besides it's called the Gregorian calendar, but the way they calculated everything, our year 0 is not exactly the year Jesus was born. They say between the year 3 BC or the year 3 AD is roughly when Jesus was born. So you could say roughly 33 AD is when Jesus would have died and been resurrected and crucified and all that sort of stuff. And so Jesus' death and resurrection happening around 33 AD. And so we don't know exactly when Mark's gospel was written, but it's likely that he was written around 55. People kind of put it towards like the late 50s, early 60s, give or take. It's hard to say, like Mark didn't say on September 14th of 17 AD, I wrote this letter. He didn't mark it that way. But that's our best estimate. And so these events that Mark is writing down happened about 20, so he's writing these events roughly 2 decades or so after the events of this, which seems like a long time, but if any of you remember any of the stuff that we went over, a few months ago at one night we did Can You Trust the Bible? Does anybody remember anything from that maybe, or that we did that? Okay, interns did because we did a whole Bible trip museum and everything. But basically, in ancient documents, the most recent documents that we would have, so you think of like Plato, his works, or like Socrates, or you think of like Aristotle, somebody like that. The earliest works, or the earliest copies of the works that we have of them, of their writings and of what they did, were hundreds of years after their existence. And so that's like our earliest in ancient history. So for the Gospels to be written only 20 years or so after the events of the things actually happening is like as close as you could possibly get to the things being written as the events are unfolding. And so of all the ancient documents, the Gospels are written by far the closest to the actual events of the things that are being written about. And so only about 20 years or so. And so as well, for context, I think this is kind of interesting to know, is that the other Gospels, when they were written, so Jesus, he would have died around 33 AD, give or take. So Mark's Gospel is about 20 years or so after the life of Jesus. Matthew's Gospel is about the same time, give or take. And there's also kind of debate of whether Mark's Gospel was the very first Gospel, because there's the 3 synoptic Gospels and they're pretty much similar to Mark's Gospel, or if Matthew's Gospel was the first Gospel. I take the road of the early church seemed to indicate that Matthew was the first Gospel, Mark was the second, Luke was the third, and John was the fourth, the way that they're written in order. But there's a lot of debate about exactly who went first and all that sort of stuff. But we do know is that Luke's Gospel is about the year 62 AD. And then John's Gospel was written around the year 85 to 95 AD, somewhere in there. There's a really important event that happens around the year 100 AD, and nothing in John's Gospel gives the indication that they are aware of this big particular event that happened in 100 AD, so they date that a little bit earlier than that. So, is all of this exciting and fun yet?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I know it's a little like, 55 AD, awesome, I'm so thrilled. But again, this kind of gives some context that these letters were not written, that these biographies, more or less, of Jesus' life were not written hundreds of years after his life. And so you span a few hundred years between the events of something and writing it down. Lots of details are going to get missed. Lots of things are going to get skewed and edited. But if you have something written so recent after the events that happens, then it just further adds to the validity of what was being written. So this then kind of leads me to kind of maybe an interesting question that maybe you thought of or maybe you have never thought of, is this basic question of what makes a letter canon, or what makes the Bible the Bible? What of this letter that Mark wrote based off the eyewitness account of Peter, why is this considered what we think of as the Bible, like your physical Bible you have? We have a collection of letters. Why is that the collection of letters that we have that we say is Bible, and not like other letters that were written? Because there was plenty of other Gospels that were written about the life of Jesus, plenty of other early church theological documents that were written. So what makes this letter, the Gospel of Mark, what makes that Bible and maybe not something else? So these are some of the criteria. This is not all of it, but these are a few that I think are really important to make mention. First is specifically when it comes to the Gospels, they had to be eyewitness accounts. If it was not an eyewitness account, it wasn't even considered whatsoever. It had to be an eyewitness account, because say I get up here and so like we did finger jousting. So Haley goes to her school and she tells her friend Hannah, whoever, do you have a friend named Hannah?
Don't say that name.
What about Jordan? You have a friend named Jordan? Okay, so you go and tell Jordan, we did finger jousting and this thing happened and that thing happened. And then Jordan then goes to her friend Jessica. They go to Jessica and they're like, oh, check out, like they did this finger jousting, all this sort of stuff. And then Jessica goes to her friend Olaf and tells them about finger jousting. By the time you're 4 people deep into the story, Olaf has many details wrong, and there's many things that are very different. And so, obviously, the eyewitness account is going to be much more accurate than 4 people down the line that account. So when it comes to the Gospels, the only Gospels that are considered are, is this an eyewitness account? Did the person that is writing this or giving this account, did they physically see Jesus? Did they walk with Jesus? If not, then their gospel is only considered good, useful information, not the scripture canon. And then as well, you have acceptance by the early church. And so as these things are written about, they are distributed amongst the early church, so the different communities. And so if they accepted it, then this would have been another tag along to the criteria. If they did not, then this would be another thing to say like, oh, okay, it probably isn't. And then as well as consistency of doctrine. So a really interesting example of this is there is a gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So there's quite a few different gospels that are written, but the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is really interesting because it's written several hundred years after the life of Jesus, and it's written with the moniker of like, oh, the disciple Thomas wrote this gospel. It's written 100 years later, so he couldn't have written this. But it sort of is trying to outline the early life of Jesus, like when he was a teenager, that sort of thing. But the interesting thing is, in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, basically you have Jesus being portrayed as like this really crazy kid that does all these pranks all the time with his superpowers, so to speak, or like his magician powers. And so he's literally killing people, raising them from the dead. He's like pulling all sorts of crazy pranks on people. If you read through the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, it's really crazy. It literally paints Jesus like practically a psychopath. And so he's doing all sorts of crazy things, and then he starts his ministry. However, the problem with that is every gospel that we have of canon, basically, when Jesus starts his ministry, everybody's like, Jesus is doing miracles? Like, just little Jesus who's never been special, nothing interesting about him, just little Jesus. They say, oh, the carpenter's son? Like, that kid's doing miracles? And so you have a confliction of either, if he was doing all sorts of crazy miracles and raising people from the dead when he was a teenager, nobody would have been surprised when he's doing miracles in his adult life. You know, see what I mean? And so there's a lot of discrepancy between the two, and so there has to be consistency of doctrine. And so Mark, it is written based off the eyewitness account of Peter. So you could kind of say that this is realistically the Gospel of Peter, but Mark is the one that writes it down. So it is written the account of Peter, or the eyewitness account of Peter. It had quick acceptance by the early church and doctrinally aligned among other letters and other things that were going on in the early church. And so people saw this letter and they did not think, oh, this is not the Jesus we knew. This aligned with the Jesus that they were aware of. The disciples accepted this, that sort of thing. And so that are some of the criteria to what makes Mark's gospel actually count. So,
Question.
yes.
So what about things that were eyewitness accounts and had consistency of doctrine but were denied by the early church, like the gospel?
That one, there would have to be a little bit more looking into. I would have to do about that one. So I can look into it more for you. I can do that. Okay, so then this gets me kind of to the outline of the Gospel of Mark. So very quickly, this is sort of the outline of roughly the way in which this letter kind of goes. So first is usually the beginning parts of these letters of most of the Gospels. It will have Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And then from his ministry in Galilee, it's then again go to his journey / missionary work or ministry in Jerusalem. And then it's going to go to his crucifixion, which is also sometimes called the Passion narrative. And so you have ministry in Galilee, journey to Jerusalem, and then you have Passion narrative. And that's roughly the outline that most of these letters fall into. And so the next slide is a little map. So here is a map of first century Jerusalem. And so I have highlighted a few spots and whatnot. So down here, if I can, hopefully you can see. Does everybody see my nice red square?
Yep.
Good. So this is Jerusalem, Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. And then up top you have Nazareth, which is Jesus from Nazareth. So that's where he would have grown up. So Jesus would have started his ministry up north in Galilee. And he would have made trips to and from Galilee to Jerusalem and that sort of thing. He made trips, but more or less the beginning of the Gospels focus on most of the things he does up in Galilee, and then it sort of majorly goes down towards his work in Jerusalem as he travels down to Jerusalem, and that is where the Passion narrative comes into play, all that sort of stuff. And so he would have moved his way back and forth and back and forth. For instance, in the Gospel of John, he goes through from Galilee through Samaria to Jerusalem, and then he goes back up and he makes a few different journeys. And so it's not exactly like he only stays in Galilee and then he makes his way to Jerusalem. There's lots of back and forth, but that's roughly at least sort of the outline of the Gospel of Mark. So how are we doing so far?
Good.
Cool. All right. I know this is thrilling stuff. Every single one of you was just like, man, I cannot wait until I learn about the outlines of the Gospel of Mark. But it's going to get gooder, okay? It's about to get gooder.
Barely put together real words.
It's about to get gooder, y'all. We gonna get gooder. Okay, so there are two big primary themes in the Gospel of Mark, and we're gonna kind of end on this tonight, and then we'll do some discussion for a little while. So there are two main themes to the Gospel of Mark. The first theme is that Mark is really wanting to clearly communicate that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, that he is 100%. That is sort of the first half of the Gospel of Mark, from chapter 1 to about chapter 8. It is all about communicating this idea that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Son of God. That is the full communication of the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. And so what you see is in Mark chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 3, it says this is at the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There we go, straight from the get-go, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his paths straight. So Mark wastes no time whatsoever in showing who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God. And what he does very first, after he just straight out says, this is the good news of Jesus, who is the Son of God, he then goes to pointing out Old Testament prophecy about this coming Messiah, this person that would eventually come, this Messiah. And so again, you have the first 8 chapters, about half of the letter, dedicated to the works of Jesus that prove that he is truly God. And so Jesus is healing people, Jesus is casting out demons, and Jesus is exercising his authority as the Messiah. And you're actually going to find this word authority that pops up quite often throughout the first several chapters of this Gospel of Mark, that his authority, that he's exercising his authority of, or as the Messiah. So to clarify really quickly, when I say the term the Messiah, probably there's lots of different little like ideas and concepts that you might have of what I mean by Messiah. Either you have no idea what I mean, or you have maybe some knowledge and maybe it's just kind of loose knowledge here and there. But this word Messiah, the word itself literally just means the anointed one, or it means the chosen one. And so when it says Jesus is the Messiah or Jesus Christ, which, fun fact for you, Jesus' name is not first name Jesus, last name Christ.
Wow.
Sorry to burst your bubble. But Jesus would have been his first name, but Christ is like a title word. So it literally means Jesus the anointed one. That's what Christ means. It means the anointed one. So
what's his last name?
Christ. Yeah, of Nazareth is his last name. Yeah, Jesus of... Exactly, yeah.
Wasn't Jesus like not his name, or wasn't it something else?
So in the, what is it, the Hebrew, realistically, I think the closest name we would have in English to Jesus' real name would be Joshua, because his name was Yeshua. There's a lot to it. I don't know exactly. Jesus sounds cooler, but realistically, his name probably would have been more like Joshua. Little old Josh.
That's like saying God came down to earth. Oh, Joshua, Jesus sounds cool. We're just calling him. Hello?
I don't remember why it's Jesus in English, but I know there's a reason, but I don't remember. I looked this stuff up in college. It's been a long time, so. All right. Okay, so the Old Testament is filled with several hundred what you would call messianic prophecies, and these prophecies are these foretelling of these things that would come of this person that is the anointed one. We now know this is Jesus, but for them, they would have just saw this as some person that would be this anointed one, this chosen one, this Messiah. And so this anointed one would one day redeem humanity back to God. And so in the context of this letter being written to the Gentiles, Mark starts his letter with one is that Jesus is the Son of God, but also this understanding that whoever this Jesus is, he did not just appear out of nowhere, but rather there was prediction to him coming. That he was in fact predicted. It's not like he was just some prophet that popped up out of nowhere, but there was a way that was prepared for Jesus, and that is especially another aspect that makes Jesus unique, is that he was prepared for, and that there are prophecies about him, that it's just not just some prophet that popped up out of nowhere. So, that is the first theme, is that Jesus is the Son of God, or that he is the Messiah, and that's the first half of this letter. And then the second half of this letter is going to go into this idea that Jesus is the suffering servant. That Jesus is first the Messiah, but then second, that Jesus is the suffering servant. And so there is going to be this major turning point in Mark chapter 8, where there's going to be this big shift where Jesus goes from basically in the apostles' mind or the disciples' mind from being the Son of God, all this authority of God rests upon him, to now in Mark chapter 8, he is the suffering servant. So if you look at Mark chapter 8, verse 31 through 33, it says, then he began, so this is being Jesus, then Jesus began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, which is kind of other terms for like the religious leaders of that day, to be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this, Jesus did, but Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, and he says these really famous lines, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns." So, in a passage like this, we give Peter a lot of flack because we're like, Peter, like, what are you doing? Like, don't you know? All that sort of stuff. Again, you have to remember that this is all happening in real time. They don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so we give Peter a whole lot of flack about this. But what we understand about the disciples and the way that the Jewish people would have thought about this Messiah one day is that they believed that this Messiah, who we know as Jesus, was going to come to this planet, and he was basically going to overthrow the Roman government and establish a physical kingdom and basically liberate the Jews. That's what they thought. So Peter, James, John, all of the disciples, what they thought was that this Messiah, who is Jesus, would come do all these miracles, exercise his authority as the Son of God, then go and overthrow the Roman government, to then take control back of Israel and establish a new liberation of the Jewish people, and all things would be perfect, and there would be this physical kingdom where Jesus would physically sit on a throne. That was what they thought of this. So you have Jesus then coming in saying, actually, I'm about to suffer and die and leave you an advocate. Is a very, very, very hard left curveball for them. They're like, hold on, Jesus, what on earth do you possibly mean? You are coming here to establish a physical kingdom, not die. And Jesus is like, get behind me, Satan. You're stupid. That's not what I'm trying to do, right? And so it's kind of like maybe the equivalent of something like this. It's like, here's my big announcement for Rhythm is actually I came here not to lead Rhythm, not to do any of this. All of this has been a big thing so that way I can recruit some people to go move to Michigan to opening a fishing shop. That is why we did Rhythm. That's why I moved here. It was not for YouthCon, not for camp, not for dyeing my hair pink, none of that. Really, the real goal of all of this, the Rhythm Room, everything, has been to recruit some people to open up a fishing shop in Michigan. So, tonight's the last... No. You're on your own. Exactly. So obviously that's a dumb example, but for these disciples, for Jesus to come, so for these disciples to hear, oh, here's this man that's going to establish and liberate the Jews, Now all of a sudden he's like, no, I'm actually going to be handed over and die, and you guys are going to watch me die, but I'm going to raise again from 3 days, and then I'm going to leave you. I'm going to leave you the advocate. For them, that's like, what do you mean, Jesus? That's not at all what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do all this sort of stuff. And so they have this sort of preconceived idea of what Jesus would do and who Jesus is. And so Mark paints this beautiful picture that Jesus is God, of Jesus being God, while a suffering servant. And so the whole theme of this book, the Gospel of Mark, really is about this very simple idea that Jesus is the servant king. That is who Jesus is. Jesus is the servant king. And so what you find in Mark chapter 10 is that Jesus even says that for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many. And so Jesus makes this statement after being asked, Jesus makes this statement of, I'm here to serve and not be served, right after the disciples are basically having this argument of like, hey, Jesus, when you establish your kingdom, who's going to sit on your left and right? Who's going to be like number 2 in command? Who's going to be number 1 in command? How is all this going to work? And so Jesus' response is not like, oh, I'm going to make you this and all that sort of stuff. Rather, Jesus' reply is his nature, is that kingship is about servanthood. Jesus' nature is that kingship is about servanthood. And so the whole theme of this book at broad and at large is really here to paint this picture that Jesus is the Son of God, but he is also the suffering servant, that Jesus is the servant king. And so the world's view of kingship is about pushing other people down in order to prop yourself up, but the kingdom of heaven is in fact about pushing people up and serving people, not pushing down so that I can elevate myself. And so every single one of us is called to serve people, not to be served by other people, but to serve people. So if you want to be like Jesus, you must serve one another. That is the pathway to being like Jesus. It's not that you are served and not that you elevate yourself, but the pathway to being like Jesus is that you serve one another. And this letter outlines this whole idea by Jesus first portraying this idea that Jesus is the servant king.
Amen, Ryan.
Amen.